You don't always know what you're feeling until hours later. Sometimes it hits you randomly, in the shower, while you're walking, right before you fall asleep. A conversation you already had suddenly feels off. Something about it didn't sit right, but in the moment you just kept going. You smiled, you responded, you played your part. And then later, your mind replays it, slower this time, more detailed, like it's trying to show you something you missed. It's not that you're unaware. It's that your awareness arrives late. And if you look closely, this doesn't just happen once in a while. It's a pattern. There are things you don't say, not because you have nothing to say, but because by the time you understand what you feel, the moment is already gone. So you let it go. Or at least it looks like you do. People around you might read this as calmness, or composure, maybe even emotional maturity. You don't overreact, you don't make scenes, you don't demand attention when something feels off. From the outside, it can look like you're easy to be around. But that's not the full story. Because what they don't see is how much processing is happening, just not in real time. There's a quiet delay between experience and emotion, between what happens and what it means to you. And most people don't question that delay, they just assume you're fine. But there's more going on here than people realize. This pattern, this delayed emotional clarity, often shows up in people who didn't always have space for their emotions to exist when they first felt them. Not because something dramatic happened. Sometimes it's much quieter than that. It can come from environments where emotions weren't exactly rejected, but they weren't really held either. Where being okay was easier than being understood. Where reactions had to be measured, controlled, timed right. So over time, your system adapts. Not by shutting emotions off completely, but by postponing them. There's a concept in psychology called emotional processing latency. It's not something people talk about often, but it describes this exact experience, the gap between feeling something and recognizing it. And that gap isn't random. It's learned. Your brain, especially the parts responsible for emotional awareness like the insular and prefrontal cortex, develops based on repeated experiences. When emotions aren't consistently mirrored or acknowledged early on, the brain starts to treat them as background noise. Not urgent. Not necessary to act on immediately. So instead of reacting in the moment, you store the experience, you move through it, and later when it's safe, when there's space, your mind comes back to it. Not to confuse you, but to finish what couldn't happen earlier. That's why clarity often arrives when you're alone. No pressure, no audience, no need to respond quickly. Just you and the truth catching up. And here, where it gets more interesting. This pattern doesn't just protect you, it also shapes how you relate to people. Because when your emotions don't show up right away, it can make connection feel slightly out of sync. Someone might ask how you feel, and you genuinely don't have an answer yet. Not because you're hiding it, but because you haven't found it. So you give something surface level, something acceptable, something that keeps the interaction moving. And by the time you understand what you actually felt, it's too late to bring it back up. So you don't. And slowly, over time, this creates a kind of emotional backlog. Unspoken thoughts, unprocessed reactions, conversations that never fully happened. Not because you didn't care, but because your timing didn't match the moment. And most people don't notice this. They just assume you're low maintenance, or independent, or not that emotional. But what they're really seeing is your ability to adapt. To function even when your internal world hasn't caught up yet. And there's a strength in that. You're not reactive. You don't let every feeling control your behavior. You can stay composed in situations where others might lose themselves. That's not something everyone can do. But there's also a quiet cost. Because when emotions are always processed later, they don't always get expressed. And when they don't get expressed, they don't always get resolved. They just get understood. And understanding something isn't the same as releasing it. So it stays. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to shape how you move, how you respond, how much you share next time. You might notice it in small ways. Like thinking of the right thing to say hours after a conversation ends. Or realizing someone crossed a boundary, but you didn't feel it clearly until later. Or feeling a kind of emotional exhaustion that doesn't match what happened on the surface. That's your system catching up. And there's nothing broken about that. In fact, it makes a certain kind of sense. Because if you grew up in spaces where emotions had to be filtered, where timing mattered, where being too expressive had consequences or felt unsafe, then learning to delay your reactions wasn't a flaw. It was precision. It was control. It was a way to stay connected without overwhelming the environment around you. And your brain got really good at it. But here's the part most people don't realize. The same system that protects you from reacting too quickly can also keep you from recognizing what you need in the moment. Because if your feelings arrive late, your boundaries often do too. And that changes how people experience you. You might come across as agreeable, easygoing, understanding. But internally, there are moments where something didn't sit right, you just didn't know it yet. So you allow things in real time that you wouldn't choose if you had full access to your emotions in that moment. And by the time you do realize it, you've already adapted. Again, that's the paradox. Your strength and your limitation come from the same place. The ability to delay emotional processing gives you stability. But it can also cost you immediacy. And when immediacy is missing, your needs can become negotiable. Not because they are, but because you don't always feel them clearly when it matters most. And still, none of this means you're disconnected. If anything, it's the opposite. Your emotional system isn't absent. It's careful. It waits. It chooses the right time. Even if that time comes later than expected. And there's a kind of intelligence in that. A quiet awareness that doesn't rush itself just to fit the pace of other people. So if you've ever felt like your emotions take longer to arrive, like you understand things deeply, just not immediately, like you replay moments trying to catch what you missed, that doesn't make you slow. It means your mind learned to prioritize safety over speed. And once you see that, certain patterns start to make more sense. Not everything needs to be fixed. Some things just need to be understood differently. Because the way you process isn't random. It's a reflection of where your emotions were allowed to exist and where they were. And that's not something you chose. But it is something you're starting to notice now. Which changes more than it seems. Because the moment you become aware of the delay, you also start to notice when it's happening. In real time. Even if it's subtle. A slight pause, a feeling that hasn't fully formed yet, a sense that something is there, just not clear. And that awareness creates a small opening. Not to force a reaction, but to stay with the moment a little longer. To give yourself just enough space to feel before it passes. And maybe that's where things begin to shift. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just slightly earlier than before. Because you don't need to become someone who reacts instantly. You don't need to change how your mind works completely. But recognizing your pattern, that alone starts to change your timing. And timing changes everything. So the next time you find yourself replaying a moment, instead of wondering why it didn't land sooner, you might start asking something else. What part of you needed more time before it could be felt at all? And if that question stays with you, you'll probably start noticing things about yourself that you've never fully put into words before. If this kind of content speaks to you, you already know what to do.